velkomin til þessara dagskrár sem Snorrastofa býður til í samstarfi við sögu jarðvang og menningarráð Vesturlands. Fyrst vil ég bera ykkur og okkur öllum kveðjuberg Þorgeirssonar sem því miður getur ekki verið með ykkur því að hann liggur í Lúnabóku heima hjá sér. Svo bið ég einnig afsökunar á töfinni sem að varða á því að við gætum byrjað, sem að stafar af því að duga engar þölur á þessa tækni til hlítar. Og þessi tækni víst eitthvað til vandræða líka. Jæja, en þið látið vita ef þið heyrið ekki. Látið mig vita. Dagskráin hér á eftir tvískipt. Fyrst ríða á vaðið þau hjónin Kevin P. Smith og Michelle H. Smith og fjalla fornleifarannsókn á Gilsbakka sumurinn 2008 og 2009. Sú rannsókn dró fram í dagsljósið meðal annars miklar vefnaðarleifar sem koma við sögu í máli Michelle og þessum hluta dagskrárinnar lýkur Hildur Hákonardóttir með umfjöllun einmitt fornan vefnað. Í síðari hluta dagskrárinnar verðum við leitt í björgin í bókstaflegum skilningi og vera kann að einhver verði beinlínis bergnuminn. Kevin Smith greinir frá nýlegri fornleifarannsókn í Surtshelli, Árni Hjartarson jarðfræðingur leiðir okkur á vit eldana sem skópur hraunið og hellana og Heimir Pálsson leitar bergbúana. Á milli verður vonandi rými fyrir fáeinar brýnar spurningar eða athugasemdir. Einhver tíma kemur að því að Íslendingar átta sig á því hversu mikla skuld við eigum að gjalda þeim erlendu fræða- og rannsóknarstofnunum sem kostað hafa og kosta margar undirstöðurannsóknir á sögu og menningu þjóðarinnar. Eru þá ónefndir fræðamennirnir sem að rannsóknunum standa. Hvort tveggja eru rannsóknir þeirra Smith hjónanna prýðileg dæmi. Þetta á raunar líka við sjálfstæðisbaráttu Íslendinga. Dönsk stjórnvöld og sjóðir kostuðu alla tíð störf Jóns Sigurðssonar og rannsóknir hans. Útgáfa íslensks fornbréfasafns, Diplomatarium Islandicum, hins mikla undirstöðurits flestra menningarsögurannsókna, prýðilegt tákn þetta og því miður líka metnað Íslendinga sjálfra í þessu efni. Því útgáfa fornbréfa hefur legið niðri síðan við sjálfir tókum við eigin málum. Þó hlóð Jón með fræðum sínum sjálfan grundvöllin undir sjálfstæði og fullveldi þjóðarinnar úr þekkingu og miðlun byggða á rannsóknum. Sú fagra veisla sem hér fram borin af aðföngum fræða. Fyrir henni standa Snorrastofa, menningar- og miðaldasetur í Reykholti, stofnun rannsóknir og miðlun borgfirskra, íslenskra og norrænna fræða. Saga, jarðvangur sem ætlað að styðja við ræktina við land og líf í viðtækum skilningi og menningarráð Vesturlands sem aflgjafi samstarfs á sama sviði. Ég nota þetta tækifæri til að þakka störf þessara stofnana og því fólki sem þar fer fyrir. Því aldrei full þakkað. Þá verður gengið til dagskrár. Fyrstan kynni ég á vettvang magister Kevin P. Smith sem greina frá fornleifarannsókn á Gilsbakka sumurinn 2008 til 2009 eða reynar 2008 og 2009. Fyrirlestur sinn nefnir hann uppgröft á heimili Arnarins. Kevin fornleifafræðingur, deildarstjóri og kúrator mannfræðideildar Braunháskóla sem kennd við Hafenrefer-safnið. Hann hefur komið víða við í rannsóknum sínum, grafið upp og rannsakað minjar frumbyggja á sinni heimaslóð, bæði indíána og eskimóa á steinaldarstigi. Hann hefur fengist við að skýra trúar- og helgisiði þessa fólks, verkmenningu og samskipti, en þeir voru veiðimenn og safnarar. Hann hefur skoðað þróun verkaskiptingar í mótun samfélaga og samhengi afkomu og stjórnmála. 2 áratuga skeið hefur hann fengist við þróunarsögu landnámssamfélagsins hér til hins skamlífa þjóðveldis og innlimun þess í Noregsveldi. Hann er höfundur margra vísindagreina rannsóknir sínar. Nú fæst hann við doktorsgráðu. Kevin tók á sínum tíma þátt í uppgreftinum hér í Reykholti og stóð síðan fyrir uppgrefti af hálsum í Hálsasveit sem stóðu ekki ómerkari aðilar en National Geographic Society, kvenfélögin í Reykholtsdal, Hálsasveit og Hvítársíðu, ungmennafélagi Reykdæla, ungmennafélagi Brúin. Uppgröfturinn á hálsum gaf innsýn í mikla járnvinnslu í Hálsasveit til forna. Gögn úr þeim uppgreftri notaði Kevin til að sanna bein samskipti fornara hálsveitunga og norrænna manna í Lands og Meadows á 19. öld. Með nokkrum hætti telst hann því til heimamanna hér, erindreki hálsveitunga og Reykdæla. Velkomin Kevin, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Gavin. Well, I apologize in advance. I did say in the abstract that they asked me to send in that this would be a rather casual talk, and I had actually not planned that, but literally 30 minutes ago my computer fried the hard drive with both of the PowerPoints on it that I was going to give today. There's only one real explanation for this that I can imagine, and that is that I was going to talk and will talk about Surtshelli. And as anyone who follows the news out of Britain knows, the Vikings of Jorvik have determined that today is the day of Ragnarok. And it appears to be true, and primarily it affects, it seems to affect my computer. So Surtur, I guess, is alive and well, just up the valley. But first, before I say that, I wanted to thank Gervaga and Dagny Masdater and Berger Thorgerson and Jonina and all of the others here at Snorrastofa and all of you in the valley and all of the people from Kvenfjällaga, Reykholti, and all of the other people who've been so kind to me over the years. I came here as a brash young graduate student in 1985 to Iceland, and came here to Reykholti in 1987, hoping to find some place to do research. And I found that it was hard not to be enchanted, both by the place and the people. And when I came here, this was still a school that was somewhat in a state of collapse. And I met this young priest named Gervaga, who told me that if he had his way, it would not be a community that died, but a community that would rise again to be what it had been before. And a medieval society, a medieval place, a place for medieval research, and a church as had never been here before. And I remember I was so taken by what he said that I spent a number of extra days working that year to use a coring device to make sure that all the places where the church was going to be was not going to destroy Snorri's whatever. And at the end of it, we felt that there was nothing there that was going to be problematized. And over the next years, I was able to witness the rise of this place. And they've been coming here now for, God, 27 years. That's really hard to imagine. And now I'm here to talk to you. In 2000, I guess it was 2000, I was working up the valley on the land of Gilsbakki at an old farm named Hals, which shows up in Landnámabók, not exactly, but certainly in jarðvangur, as being a farm that was supposed to have been abandoned in the ancient times, in the settlement times. And Geir had helped me to find this while I was trying to think of a place to do research, because while the National Museum was digging here at Reykholti, I wanted to study what happened. People tell me this is very American. Rather than looking at the chieftain, I wanted to look at what was happening to the common people. And so I began working there. And every year that I came, a very nice, very helpful amount of money would show up in a bank account for me down in Borgarnes from good people around here. And we went down a couple of times to meet the manager of the bank, and he was very nice. And in 2000, I came back again. I was working at Halsa, And I had been thinking for years about Gilsbakki. And the reason, again, I was thinking about Gilsbakki is as an American, I was interested in all the things that happened here in the Sturman period, and how Reykholti rose to power. But I knew that just up the valley was the other center of power, the home of the eagle, as I was saying, because in Gunnlaug's Saga, of course, in the beginning, in the dream, he flies as an eagle out of the mountains down up in the valley. And I said to Gerard that I told him that I was interested in this possibility, and he said, well, let's go up and meet the man at Gilsbakki. He might be interested. And we went up and we met Magnus at Gilsbakki, and I suddenly realized that he was the manager of the bank that I'd been going to before. And we talked for a while, and he told me at that time that if I ever was interested in working at Gilsbakki, that that would be something he'd be interested in seeing something done. And years went by. In 2008, while I was sitting at my desk in Providence, Rhode Island, eating lunch and looking at Google Earth, which was kind of new at that point, and had these great images from Western Iceland, I was scanning through and looking for archaeological sites and found a couple of very large and interesting sites on Google Earth. And so I wrote a small grant to the National Science Foundation in the United States about the possibility of going and looking and testing some of these. And we saw one very large one. We thought it was pretty interesting. We got the money. We came up here. And after about a week and a half of working at this place on the farm Efranes, a place now called Skornes, we discovered it was a very large site and a huge place for digging peat back in the 16 and 1700s. Now that's an interesting story in its own right, but not that interesting, to be honest. You can only dig a peat digging place so many times before you get very uninteresting in seeing in Redinger. And I remembered then what Magnus had said, and we had a couple of weeks left on the project, and I wrote to him. And we went up and saw him again, and I asked him, would you be interested in having us work at Gilsbakki a little bit? And he said yes, he would. And the reason he was interested is that he remembered that when he was a younger man in the 1950s, and they built the new house there, the new house at the time, and it had a deep cellar in it, that they dug through deposits that, as he said, as you looked at one side of the floor, it had a big smile of ash, and 10 meters away on the other side, a big smile of ash, and all sorts of deposits. And for 50 years, he said he had been worried that they had dug through at Lugi the Black's house and had destroyed the archaeology there. Now, as I said, my PowerPoint is gone, so you're just going to have to work with mind pictures, I think, for the most part. We've got some possibilities here, but I think it's easier to just give you a sense of what we found. We started off on that wonderful warm summer by going between the new houses, the big house built in 1917, and the church. And there's a slope there. And it looked like any other tomb that you would see. But we started off by coring, by taking cores out of the earth down through, and immediately, this is something I do all the time, began to realize that there were deep and intact cultural deposits there. Whatever they'd hit with the house, they'd only hit a part of it. A former student of mine and a colleague now, Tommy Urban, who is with us, had a wonderful device that looks like a ski that's called an electromagnetic resonance device, and he walked over the property, and what that does is it sends an electric current down into the ground underneath and sends back charges that show you what is down below the ground. Unfortunately, not to the point that you can see everything, but you see a series of patterns, green, red, yellow, black, that begin to tell you what is below the ground. And as we looked through that, we could see what appeared to be a whole network of walls down beneath the ground, and a huge area that was full of color and full of response, which usually means a lot of metal in the ground. And we hypothesized that on that slope, underneath it, was probably a large askehöger, a large midden, where all the garbage had been thrown out. And beside it, maybe the remains of some houses. So we put two small trenches across the thing. We just really had a few weeks, actually about 7 days. And we just wanted to get a sense of what was there. So we laid out two trenches, each 5 meters long and 1 meter wide, and began digging and going down. And by the end of 7 days, we were down 1.5 meters in each trench, and we were still nowhere near the bottom. In fact, we were only in the 1400s. And there was so much material that came out of the site that although I had worked at Reykholti and worked at other sites in the West, it was more abundant in a small area and more that we had to process and catalog than I'd ever seen before. Now, I was really interested in this because as you go back through the history of Gilsbakki, you see that in the historical sources, it is until about 1205 one of the most important and one of the most powerful farms in the west of Iceland. Obviously, it's the home farm of Gilsbakki and Gunnlaug Wormsson. It is, thank you very much, Gerd. Their descendant is listed in the list of one of the greatest priests in Iceland in the early 11th century. In Grænlandi about it, Koðrán Hermundsson, or Hermann Koðránsson, I have a hard time remembering without my computer, is noted as having arrived in the west of Greenland with trading ships, and to have gone on from Greenland back to Norway and back, and to have been involved in all of these trading networks back and forth. And obviously the list of chieftains goes on until our good friend Snorri Sturluson, who used to live right around us, in about 1205, managed to take over the Gilsbakki as well, as he began to establish his power throughout all of this area. And this was perfect for me because, as I said, as an American archaeologist, I was as interested in knowing what happens to the people who didn't become the most powerful. If we're going to understand the processes of how Iceland became unified for a short period of time under Þórður Kakali and the Sturlungs before him, and we want to understand that Sturlung period, we cannot just look at those who rose to the top of the power, but also know what happened to those around them. And of course, after that, the history of Gilsbakki goes from Staður to Beneficium, and by 1258, the district of Hálsasveit, or the little parish at Storiaus, gets stripped away as a different place. The burials still go on at Gilsbakki, and by 1608, Gilsbakki then has a much smaller parish than it had had before. Until 1917, Gers, or 1912, that eventually Reykholt's parish takes over Gilsbakki's as well. So it's an 1100-year period there in which these two centers of power are balancing each other, but Gilsbakki becomes the lesser place over time. And yet it's still occupied. Well, it turns out that the fact that it's still occupied, but not in the same way that Reykholti is great for the archaeology. Reykholti is, as anyone who's looked at the archaeology here or done archaeology here knows, is a little bit perplexed archaeologically by the richness of this place and the number of things that have happened. There are power lines that go through the site, there are electric lines, there are water lines. At Gilsbakki, there is none of this, because the farm has not been quite as well established over those periods of time. By the end of the 2008 season, as I said, we'd been down about 1.5 meters in the site, and we were finding things down in the layers from the 14 and 1500s that we rarely saw anywhere else, including massive amounts of textiles and cloth, which Michelle will talk about a little bit. It began getting us thinking and getting her thinking about what were the women doing, what were they weaving, and why was all this material here. But we also knew that there was too much to do that year. And so we wrote another grant to the National Science Foundation in 2009 and came back and finished the project and got down to the bottom. And the bottom of the trenches was 2.4 meters below the surface. So a bit higher, a bit farther down. If I was standing in it, as I was at the end, that would be about the top of the grass growing up above me. The stratigraphy, we as archaeologists, we date things not only by radiocarbon dating and by the tephra, the volcanic ash layers that are in it, but also by the sequences of layers that build up over time. The stratigraphy at Gilsbakki is intact, it is beautiful, and it is formed of a sequence of the deposits, the layers where people were doing their activity for 100, 150 years at a time, and then huge blankets of turf from when the houses were torn down, and the turf walls and the ceilings were spread over the land, and then they started again living on top of that. And so it allows us to break the archaeology of that site down into a sequence of buildings that, even though our trenches only intersected one of the buildings we were looking at, we can still see the sequences of when they were built. We know that the oldest things at the site date to just after the arrival of the Norse. At the very bottom, 2.4 meters below the surface in the second trench that we did, at the bottom is a compressed turf wall, which is full of the Landnam tephra from 871 AD. And a centimeter below it, we can see that tephra layer intact, the volcanic ash layer. And so we know, even though Landnam would say that, that the family of Gilsbakki began at Hallmundarhrauni and then moved down a little bit, somebody was living there right from the beginning. And just as early as at Reykholti, and just as early as at Hals, and every other site that we've seen in this area. It implies that the settlement into the interior of this part of Iceland was extremely fast, and extremely thorough, and extremely well positioned. Above that, we can see that the first house was torn down around was probably built around 900 and then torn down about 1150. Above that, there's the remains from floors that clearly the occupation layers go to about 1300, and then there's another layer. Now, I wished we could say a lot about the earliest occupants of Gilsbakki, but they were extremely clean people. There were almost no artifacts in this area, no bones, no artifacts, nothing. And naturally, when you're digging a hole that deep, you have to narrow it and narrow it and narrow it down. So we were seeing very small areas at the bottom. What I can say is that the remains from the house that was torn down around 1300, 1350, is the largest and thickest blanket of turf that I've ever seen in any sites. It implies that whatever the house was at the end of the Sturlung period was a massive house, and probably just up the hill from us. Above that, we've got the deposits of a house that was occupied until about 1450, and we hit the walls of that just where the electromagnetic survey had told us we should find a house. And at that point, we begin to get a much richer artifactual layer. This is at the end of the Catholic period here, when this was a beneficium, and we have nice pieces of bronze buckles and of bronze vessels in there, pits full of fire-cracked rock and the bones of cows and sheep from at least one big feast outside the place, and a very rich deposit that needs someone to look at it in greater detail down the line. That house is then torn down around 1450, 1475, and another one is built on top of that, and that's occupied for about 150 years, overlapping the period when the Hanseatic merchants were trading in this part of Iceland, and also overlapping the beginning of the Reformation here. And the most interesting thing we would see there in the deposits from that part is that that's when we begin to see what I like to think of as a material culture of Protestantism arriving at this point. So we see that the people at Gilsbakki suddenly acquire ceramics from Denmark, from northern Germany, from the Netherlands, things that we had never seen before. There was no pottery at the site before that. We begin to see glass that has arrived from the same area. An enameled Dutch knife handle, a beautiful, I wish I could show it to you here, but it's a beautiful blue, white, and dark blue enameled bronze knife handle of exactly the sort you can see in Flemish still life paintings from the early 1600s. And a few other things that were relatively unexpected, one of which was a small lead piece of ammunition, an unfired ball, 11 millimeters in diameter, from a layer of about 1620, which is clearly the size for a pistol of that period. So an offensive weapon, just after the period when, in 1574, weapons were prohibited in Iceland, and after the Vopnadómur of 1581, when Icelanders tried to get the right to carry weapons again. So who was carrying around a weapon, a loaded pistol, at Gilsbakki in 1620? It's an interesting question. As we begin looking at some of the priests who are living in that area at that time, I don't look at you, Ger. I know you have a couple of rifles. This is a pistol. At least one of them, who was a priest in Gilsbakki in the very early 1600s, 1620s, was the son-in-law of at least one of the Syslumaður, of the Lögmaður here in the West. And we know this is a period of time at the end of the after the Reformation, of turmoil in Iceland, when there are pirates in various places, when there is a bit of instability, when there are all of the attempts to burn witches and such. It may be that we're seeing, this is apparently the only musket ball of this sort in all of Iceland from all of that time, from all the excavations that have been done. So even though it's a single thing, it's not a random thing, and nothing that we can just simply ignore. The same people were among the first smokers of tobacco in all of Iceland. We have pipe tobacco fragments there from the very early 1600s, and it's also when we begin to see wine bottles appearing in quite great numbers, which reminds me that Magnus told me that there were stories still carried down at Gilsbakki that one of the priests about that time was heavy enough that no horse could carry him, and also that one of the priests was said to have burned down part of the place in a bit of a, it was a bon vivant, is basically what I was told. I don't know if that's what's happening here. As we go farther up through the record at Gilsbakki, the big story is that this is a place which, even though it's deep into the interior of Iceland, and even though it has less authority than it had in the Viking Age, maybe, or the early medieval period, it had a lot of land. It was very wealthy. And they were among the earliest adopters of all of the types of ceramics that we see coming in. Before, at the end of the trade monopoly, we still see that things are coming in from Britain. They're coming in from Holland. We see all of the newest types of ceramics arriving at the time. Now, I didn't know until Hildur Håkonsdóttir told me, because I'm not Icelandic, and I don't sing the proper Christmas songs. I had never heard of Gilsbakka Thula, and somehow no one had ever told me about this. And when she told me about this just earlier this year, in January, I immediately found it on YouTube and listened to it, and translated it, and read through it, and I thought, oh my God, what a beautiful poem, written by Kolbeinn Thorsteinsson, I think, in 1765 for his young daughter Gudrun, as she's coming up from Bjarnarstaðir, a place I've been to many times to visit, and they talk about bringing out the tea kettles, and bringing out the wine, and bringing out the things. And in our excavation from that period, sure enough, if there aren't fragments of teacups, and of the wine bottles, and of all of these things. And I cannot tell you that these are the ones that she drank from, or someone else. But I can tell you that these are from the appropriate period of time, and this is what I think Kolbeinn Thorsteinsson was saying there, not only the love of his daughter, not only the love of the place, not only the love and enthusiasm of life in that place in the Christmas season, but they were also talking about the fact that they were connected to the outside world. And when you look at the archaeological record for that site, that is exactly just the time when that is written, that they get the first teacups, and they've got English teacups and Chinese porcelain teacups, and all of these things that they're singing about. I think they're not singing just because we've done this for a long time, but this is really a sign that they have actually made it, and they are connected to the world. And that's something that then in the 19th century, as you read especially the explorers or the travelers' accounts of people coming to Gilsbakki, whether it's William Morris or others, there's always the discussion of, and we came, and the housewife and the jolly priest, or the not-so-jolly priest, depending on who they talk, would bring out the tea set and bring out the coffee. And it was the first thing that happened. And we see those pieces of pottery all the way through the next, from the 1760s right up to the 1880s when the archaeological record ends, in incredible numbers. There are well over 1,400 fragments of pottery from that 10-meter segment alone, which is one of the largest pottery collections in Iceland from that period of time. And one of the things that really fascinates me is that we can see, for example, English pottery that was made around 1780 to 1820 was in use at that site for at least 60 to 80 years, repaired, constantly, lovingly repaired. As new material came up, even though we know the households are changed, we can see fragments from the same sets of pottery, which means that some of this was staying with the farm, even as new households came in. And so when you read those accounts of hospitality at Gilsbakki in that period of time, it's not only what the individual housewives and husbands were bringing in, but also probably the things that were recognized as when you went to Gilsbakki, this is that early silverware, this is that early pottery, this is the earliest stuff we saw in this area, and we are still using it over and over and over again. We know that they were one of the early adopters of the Burstebyer farm type that Skuli Magnusson and others thought was going to be a useful way of modernizing Icelandic housing. And that house stayed up until about 1917. Now, as I said, Gilsbakki's role as a church, as a parish church, ended about that same time, in the teens, when Reykholti became the church that oversaw it. And the families there, who had been the priests at that farm for almost 1,000 years, 900 years at that point, became farmers and local administrators. And like Magnus, as I was always told, one of the four wisest men of the west of Iceland. Many of them perhaps were. But even so, in 1917, we see that when they tore the last of those houses down, they built one of the grandest cement houses and first cement houses in this area that still stands up to the top. And we were told, I'm told it also still has a ladder from the old house that had to be there, because a ghost that lived in the house lives on that ladder and goes along with it. We never saw her. I don't know. But I think what it tells us is that a place like Gilsbakki that was important to begin with, that was very important from the time of Iceland's settlement, through that period of the sagas, even though it became less important in the political life and the ritual life of Western Iceland, or of Iceland in general, or the North Atlantic, retained a sense and a spirit of place and authority, and a place that was and remains important because of its history and its heritage. And we could see from the archaeological record that each of the successive families living there maintained that sense of pride and constant acquisition of the newest things. They had the land to do it as well, and they had the wealth to do it, and they had the opportunities to hunt in the highlands. They had a lot of ways to do it, but nonetheless, there was none of that going into the dark night quietly that one might think for people whose authority in a region had decreased. And by maintaining that cultural authority, maintaining that sense of identity as a key place, it remained important up until the early 20th century, and I would say does so to today. So what are the most important things that we can say we learned about Gilsbakki? First of all, we answered Magnus's question right off. The site is intact. It is large. It is huge. It would repay a lot of excavation, but to do the excavation, because the site is so large and so deep, and in the middle of a place where people live, it would be complex, it would be expensive, and it would take a long time, which is part of the reason, to be honest, why I didn't go back. I don't have the time to really dedicate to that. It will take somebody a lifetime. If they do it, it will be one of the more important excavations to be done here in Western Iceland. I think beyond that, we were able to see that this is a site that has a bit of a microcosm. It tells a little bit of all of the history of this region. And it's just a place which needs to be recognized by all of you and by people beyond as a place of enduring importance into the future. And I would like to extend all of my thanks to all of the family up at Gilsbakki, to the Gilsbakki for their kindness and their hearty enthusiasm for our work there. And thank you very much. I'm sorry we don't have any slides to share with us.
Þakka þér fyrir Kevin. Það hefur nú sannarlega ekki týnst fyrir okkur að á Gilsbakka hefur verið haugþing á bergi frá öndverðu. Og enn. Nú, þó að tíminn líði og við séum á eftir með dagskrána og allt það, þá verðum við nú að gefa smá smugu fyrir spurningar eða athugasemdir. Og það kannski mín vegna sem ég segi það sem að Kristleifur sagði alltaf þegar fólk sagði honum að það hefði ekki tíma, hann skildi það aldrei því að samkvæmt því sem hann hafði reynt og taldið þá kemur nú meiri tími á morgun, sagði Krilli. Það væri ástæðulaust að hafa miklar áhyggjur af því. Við höfum áhyggjur af tímanum en orðið laust ef einhver vill spyrja eða koma með andrúsni. Gjörðu svo vel, Páll.
Hann nefndi þarna að það hefði orðið meiri fátækt á tímabili, kannski nokkuð löngu tímabili. Hvaða tímabil var þetta? Hvenær versna kjörin?
Kevin, he's asking when was there a sign of increased poverty? Did you find anything?
It's hard to say, how do you measure poverty? That's a very hard thing archaeologically. If I were to say, was there an immaterial possessions, there is none. If I were to say from a material standpoint, from when do we have the largest number of objects and the largest diversity, then you would have to say that the poorest period at Gilsbakki was from 900 AD till 400 AD, when there's nothing showing up. But we had small trenches. And if we opened up a larger area, I'm sure you would see quite a bit from that period. What we could see, and I find this quite interesting, is that there was a change around 1400 to 1450, maybe 1500, from fairly heavy reliance upon cattle, as we see in much of Iceland, to almost sole reliance on sheep ranching at the site. So we don't see hardly any cattle bones afterwards. And as we get farther into the post-medieval period, there are many, many, many more fish bones from local fishing. But that may be simply preservation. Fish bones decay very well. We also see that as you get into the late 1600s, early 1700s, that the amount of bone that has been burnt as fuel and the amount of turf ash from burning turf instead of wood increases as well. But there's no real sign at the site that you could say is actually ever an indication of poverty, whether you measure it in terms of the number of artifacts, the density of artifacts, the types of artifacts, the diversity of artifacts that are found. I suspect if we could open up the whole area and see changes in the size of the houses and a number of other indicators, we'd probably see some happening, but there's nothing really to indicate it. I'd hoped in that perverse American way that I would be able to see how the loss of authority in the 13th century and the loss of power over time had translated into increasing amounts of poverty or decreasing wealth, perhaps. Instead, it seems to be that as that authority locally reduced, people are making conscious efforts to continue to have at least the trappings of a good life and of a wealthy life. So I can't say that we can see any specific indications of it.
Einhver annar, við fáum færi á þeim seinna. Ef einhverjum dettur, já, gjör það svo vel.
Just very quickly, Kevin, pollen analysis, was there any of that?
There wasn't.
Barley?
There wasn't at this one, because we really were only there for 2 weeks of testing. That would obviously be the next thing that I think we would want to do. I mean, there's been good pollen analytical work at over by Gilsbakka and up here at Reykholti, I think, and other places. But it was not or Reykholti, but it was not something that we had the ability to do at that point. If you're volunteering, I might be able to get some samples.